Good evening. My name is Anki King. I am the Associate Director of the Phyllis Harriman Mason Gallery here at the Art Students League of New York. Thank you so much for joining us for the League's free public program series. Our additional thanks go to the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs and all our generous donors who make this program possible. In tonight's program, two artists who are both previous League students and current instructors, Ellen Eagle and Jerry Weiss, will join me for a visit to the current exhibition, Faces of the League, which includes 60 portraits from our permanent collection. And you can find more information on Jerry and Ellen, as well as the exhibition, on our website, theartstudentsleague.org. Welcome, Jerry and Ellen. If any of our audiences have questions during this talk, please go ahead and post them on Facebook Live, and we will try to answer as many of them as possible at the end of this talk. We will now bring you around the exhibition, and we will introduce you to a few of the paintings, and hopefully you can come see them in person during this last week of the show. My focus when selecting the works for the exhibition was to locate less formal and more unique portraits where I could clearly see personal voices. And as I was selecting the works, I found that what many of them had in common was that they had to do with very personal relationships. And this made me wonder, is it these relationships themselves that make this work more unique and interesting? And we will touch upon some of these connections in this talk. So I will start by bringing you into the show, which you are seeing now on the screen. And then one of the first works you will see upon entering the gallery is the following painting. This is a painting by Alfred Quinton Collins, who was born in 1833. He, as so many artists, he studied in Paris, and we know that he lived in New York, but unfortunately, not a lot of information about him as an artist exists today. We know that some of his work are in museums and galleries, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art has a beautiful painting of his wife, which is so touching. And he seems to have been making his living by making commissioned portraits. Unfortunately, he destroyed many of his own works before his death. So that's a sad story. The person in the painting, this is Joe Evans. And it appears that these two were close. This is a slightly more formal portrait. You can tell that there's great respect between the artist and the sitter here. It's very detailed, it is very sensitive. And Joe Evans himself is a very interesting person. He suffered from severe physical disabilities, which are not at all visible in this painting. But we have two works of him in this show, both by Alfred Quinton Collins. And in the second one, you will see that he displays the physical disabilities that he suffered from. So we don't have the date of the first portrait that you just saw, but we know that the second portrait was painted right around the year that he became president of the Board of Control here at the Art Students League. So even though he suffered from physical disability, he was very active in the art world in New York, and he would always volunteer. Anybody asked him to, take part in any artistic endeavors, he would always be there. He was very positive. He was known for being very intelligent, bright mind, and he would never complain. He would always be optimistic. And this, of course, earned him a lot of respect in the art world and amongst his friends. He had a lot of friends. So earlier he was vice president for the League's board, and then in 1890 the League moved into its current building, and Joe Evans was the president for the following 3 years. And I think it speaks of the closeness between Alfred and Joe that he allowed himself to be portrayed this way, where you actually see his physical disabilities. It's very clear that his legs are, very thin, not a lot of strength. But he obviously had strength of mind in great proportions. He, amongst other things, was also the secretary of the Society of American Artists, and he was a good friend of Dennis Bunker, who was a very well-known artist and also a member of the Society of American Artists. This painting by Alfred Quinton Collins was painted only 2 years before he died. He passed away at a young age. He was only 47. And Joe himself also passed away quite early. He was only 40 years when he passed away. And he was a painter himself, and he worked with landscape painting. And the League is lucky enough to have one of his landscape paintings in our collection, which you'll see on the next slide. And this is a small painting. It's about 14 by 12. It was painted in 1884. And it was said that it was in his exquisitely painted landscape that you can find the melancholy that he never expressed personally, which is a very beautiful, beautiful saying. We are now going to move on to a more modern painting, this one by Harvey Dinnerstein. And Ellen, I know Harvey studied here at the League in 1946, and then he became an instructor around 1980, and you studied with Harvey.
Yes, I did. I started at the League in 1995. Yes, 1995. And actually, I attended the League when I was 10 years old and then returned as an adult. I studied with Harvey for at least 6 years, I would say. And I am crazy about his work. And this is a portrait that he painted of his wife in 2020. Lois has sat for Harvey for decades. And the light on her face and her hand is reminiscent of Vermeer for me. And also the expansive wall with the light on the wall is also Vermeer-like to me. And I wonder about the vertical doorway or wooden wall. I wonder if it's just a compositional device so that Lois wouldn't be a big dark triangle in the center of the canvas, or if the artist didn't want us to know what Lois was looking at over her shoulder, didn't want to include us in that view. But what really strikes me here is the tenderness and the reverence that you see in his work for his wife. There is light in her eyes. She's very bright. We know he respects her mind so much. She is an art historian. And her lips are parted. I think the husband and wife are having a conversation, and they are connected through her parted lips. I feel like he could reach out and touch her cheek or take her by the hand. I think they're having a very pleasant conversation, very relaxed. And she has given herself to him and his work for decades, and his respect is enormous. The married couple is so keenly observed and conveyed in this painting. And the next painting that I would like to talk about was done, this is another portrait of Lois done in 1960 to 61. Harvey describes in his book that he started the painting when Lois was pregnant with their second child, and he finished it after the birth. So he set up the big shapes during the pregnancy. Here again, this is reminiscent of Vermeer, with the piece of furniture in the foreground, the fabric folded on top of it, the everyday domestic scene. It's almost a mundane scene. The cookware, the paintings on the wall remind me of the maps in so many of Vermeer's paintings. And again, that expansive wall. The light on her neck suggests vulnerability to me. There's a world out there that she's not seeing right now. What is happening outside? Her hair is gathered almost precariously. It could tumble down and fall at any moment. But the main thing about this painting for me is the weariness that is apparent in the figure. Harvey loves this woman and wants to know everything he can about her. But one thing he can't know is really about the work of pregnancy. What is her body feeling? How tired is she? Even her hands look tired as she holds the bowl. And she's in her private thoughts. Harvey conveys the fact that she's the only one who can know what she's going through by the way he turned her gaze away from the viewer and bathed her face in shadow. So there's a distance between Lois and us, which is also suggested or also achieved by the piece of furniture in the foreground.
Yes, this is beautiful, Ellen. And it's interesting that in the portrait we have in the exhibition, the light comes on her face, while here it's on her back.
Yes, yes, she's looking outward in the first one and looking inward in the second one.
Yeah, it's great.
And I can hardly walk away from this painting. This is one of my favorite paintings ever created.
So great. Thank you so much for sharing that. And we are now going to move over to another lovely young woman. And it's the woman in the painting that I'm talking about here, obviously. And Jerry, I know you have written about this work before, so please tell us, what is this?
Of course, but first, Anki, thank you for inviting me to participate with you and Ellen. And I just want to say very quickly how terrific this exhibition is. You've drawn, I think, very perceptibly from the League's collection to bring out representative works that are both by well-known artists and by some really obscure artists. But each of them have connections with other artists and with the League. So it's really quite a marvelous show. The painting is actually, the painter who did this checks off both boxes. Eugene Spiker was very famous, basically between 1910 and World War II. He had a run of great success. There was in the 1930s a lengthy profile of him in Esquire magazine that referred to him as the most important artist in America. And now, certainly since the 1940s, Spiker has been in almost total eclipse. This painting might be the most famous one in the League collection, not by virtue of it being a Spiker, but because of the story around it. The model was the young George O'Keeffe, who was also an art student at the League when this was painted in 1908. And the story is quite well known. I'm going to read a short passage that O'Keeffe wrote about this encounter with Spiker. Eugene Spiker was one of the older students at the League and a very handsome young man. He often stopped me and wanted me to pose for him. Spiker wanted to paint me, but I wanted to work myself. One morning, as I climbed to the top floor of the life glass, there he sat with his fresh linen smock, blocking the whole stairway and threatening that he would not let me pass unless I promised to pose for him. I was annoyed and I wanted to go up to work. It doesn't matter what you do, he said. I'm going to be a great painter, and you will probably end up teaching painting in some girls' school. I insisted on passing, and he remarked, I'll give you the painting if you pose for me. Finally, he let me go, and I went down the dark hall to the life class. The model happened to be a very repulsive man who gave me the creeps. So I gave up and went back to Spiker. He worked very quickly, and the portrait was soon finished, probably because he had it so clear in his mind when he started. The story touches on so many interesting chords, not the least of which are, I remember what it was like to be a young art student and to try to find fellow art students who would sit for me. Usually we posed for each other. That was often the way of doing it, reciprocating. But more importantly, it really frames the misogyny that exists and the dynamics that exist in terms of gender roles in art. And I'm using present tense because I'm not convinced that that is part of our past, even though this story is from 1908. It's quite a good portrait of O'Keeffe. We have a lot of photographs of what she looked like later on. But this is the image of her when she was in her early 20s and just starting out as an art student. We have a couple of more paintings, I think, some slides of Spiker's later work. Okay, this is a portrait he did some years later. This goes away from, and this is a life-size portrait of a blacksmith who was a neighbor of Spiker's in Woodstock, New York, where he ended up moving. Very different feeling from the kind of William Merritt Chase inspired subtle lighting and palette that he used when he was a student. Probably the best endnote to this anecdote is that 6 years later, O'Keeffe came back to New York. She actually left for quite a few years. And when she came back in 1914, she got a letter from Spiker asking her to pose again and saying again that he would give her the painting. And we have no idea if she ever responded or ever sat for him again. But what we do know is that she kept the letter from Spiker. And when she died in the 1980s, it was found in her estate. And that's pretty much what we know about the dynamic between Spiker and O'Keeffe. While his reputation descended, O'Keeffe became one of the most iconic presences in American art.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jerry, for sharing that story. That is so fascinating.
Yeah.
And I know Spiker studied with, as you mentioned, William Merritt Chase and also Frank Vincent Dumond. And the next slide is also a student of William Merritt Chase, but this is very different. She studied, she was born about 4 years before Spiker. This is Wilhelmina Weber Furlong, and I'm talking about the woman in the painting, not the artist right now. And Wilhelmina studied at the League as a very young woman. She was 14, 15 years old when she studied with Chase. She, as so many artists, studied, around the world. She lived and worked in Mexico for a while. She spent 9 years in Paris, and then she moved to New York. And she was hailed when she returned as one of the first female modernists, and she was very influential for the modern art movement. And she also taught art in New York for most of her life. Both Wilhelmina and her husband, Thomas Furlong, were involved with the Art Students League. They were both on the board of control here, and she was also the secretary treasurer at some point. I know that they had a gallery together. He was more of a realist, while she was, inspired by all the years in Paris. In the next slide, you'll see a photo of Wilhelmina when she was a young artist, about 20 years old here, painting away. And the next slide will be one of her modernist paintings. We don't have a year on this one, but you get, knowing that Spiker did what he did during about the same time, you know how extraordinary this was. And going back to the painting, I wanted to say a little bit about the artist who created this work, which is Dorothy Denner, who some of you might be familiar with. She was 20 years junior of Wilhelmina. And I don't know if they met at the League, but it seems likely, or maybe somewhere where Wilhelmina was teaching in New York. So Denner was born in 1901. She originally started out studying theater, and then upon a trip to Europe when she was about 24, she discovered all that Europe had to give. And she was so inspired by the Cubism, Fauvism, Constructivism, and was particularly fond of Picasso. So when she came back to the States, she came to the Art Students League to study sculpture. But she found that the sculpture department was a little bit too traditional. And so she ended up mainly focusing on drawing, and she studied with Kenneth Miller for several years. While at the League, she met her husband, who was a sculptor, David Smith. They met in 1926, and they married the following year. And both of them were very close to Wilhelmina Furlong, and she had bought property in Bolton Landing and brought them both up there, and they ended up with property there as well, and they traveled back and forth. They continued to study at the League, and especially with Jan Matulka, who was a great inspiration for the modernist movement. And you can see in this painting that Furlong looks to be squinting, and we have found that she had problems with her eyes as she got older. She's about 53 in this painting, and this was painted right as, I think it's from 31. So this was right after Dorothy and her husband had moved up to Bolton Landing. They were traveling back and forth, but they were obviously close to each other when they were there. They, were neighbors. So Dorothy's marriage to David Smith was somewhat challenging, and they divorced in 1951. It's said that he saw her as competition because she kept wanting to do sculpture, and he was a sculptor. So she limited herself to doing paintings and drawings while they were married. But in 51, right after they divorced, she had her first solo show. She then went on to make fantastic sculptures, and the League is lucky enough to have one of them in our collection. This one from 1990, just 4 years before she passed away. And then, strangely enough, another artist with a William Merritt Chase connection, but very much earlier, before Chase taught here, is the artist in the next work we're going to talk about, which is Frederick Warren Freer. And he knew William Merritt Chase from being in Europe around 1877 to 80. And Ellen, tell us a little bit about this work and why it inspires you.
Yes. The first thing that I noticed about this painting was, again, the extremely strong light on the flesh tones and the sharp edges in comparison to what I had been looking at in Harvey's work. Frederick Freer studied in Munich, where Dutch painting, 17th century Dutch painting, was adored. And they were trained in that same kind of composition and color work where there's a very strong light on the flesh and dulled down earth tones surrounding it. He grew up in Illinois. He and his sister were sent to Munich with the family so that Frederick and Cora, his sister, could study in Munich. After he studied in Munich, the family came back to the United States. He was very, very active in Illinois, Chicago, I should say, art scene. And he eventually taught at the Art Institute of Chicago, where he developed a popularity rivalry of sorts with John Vanderpoel, who authored The Human Spirit. But what captivates me about this painting, oh, and there is also a William Merritt Chase connection here, as you mentioned. He traveled with William Merritt Chase, and then when he came to New York, he had a job teaching drawing, painting, and composition at the Art Students League at the same time that William Merritt Chase was teaching here. But what captivates me about this painting is the content. Her religious faith is represented, of course, by the cross that she wears. But to me, her facial expression is one of extreme skepticism. She looks very guarded and not trusting. I'm reading into it, of course. I'm bringing, everybody interprets it differently, but that's how it strikes me. She also looks a little guarded in the expression in her eyes. So the ambiguity of the two elements of the skepticism and the faith, I think is very interesting. And I think that's what gives the painting its drama.
Yeah, that is very interesting. I know that he used his family members a lot in his paintings. I wonder if this is a family member less than thrilled to be sitting for him.
He and his wife had 6 children. 2 of them died at a very young age. His wife was an artist as well and a model, and he painted her throughout the years. He also painted very glamorous women and seemed to be taken with textures that were see-through, like lace and mirrors and glass. And I love that the frame says presented to the Art Students League.
Yeah.
I believe he taught for 1 year, or that might have been one of the other.
I think a little bit longer. I think he was teaching about 80, like this is 1884 to 89. Yeah. So we're going to move on to the next work. And Jerry, I don't think there is a Chase connection here, or am I wrong?
No, I don't think Sawyer, this is Raphael Sawyer, of course. I don't think he studied with Chase. Sawyer, in fact, I can't recall if he studied at the League. I know he studied at the National Academy. I believe he taught at the League later on. And I believe both of his brothers, Moses and Isaac, also taught at the League at some point. Sawyer was, for me, a very influential artist when I was a young painter. He was one of my favorite New York painters. And he started out as a member of the 14th Street School with a studio around Union Square, and he painted, when he started off in the Depression era, he painted topical subjects, if you will. People, he hired models who were, in one case, I believe, a homeless man or a hobo, who was a popular artist model at the time. Later on, he especially painted, he stuck with New York subjects and painted other artists and painted writers and actors. So he was very much in his representational work and his figure work and his portraiture, a New York painter with a few excursions out of state, a few main paintings here and there. He was, as I say, very important to me for his empathy, for his compassion, for what comes through in his paintings, a sensitivity to his sitters. And it's even true in a very small oil like this, which, when I saw this, reminded me of another painting he had done. And if we can flip to that image, it's clearly related to this painting, which is dated 1940. I don't know if the head was a preparatory sketch or if it was just, if he was pleased with this as a painting in and of itself. But it's the same model and scene in profile. and as a reminder that artists will find a subject and find an angle and go to it more than once, revisit it. What's interesting also about the League's painting is the inscription near the bottom. If we can return to that for a moment. For Bob and Rochelle Phillip, with friendship. So this was painted around 1940. We can surmise that much. And this was about the time that Sawyer started working together with Phillip in Phillip's Carnegie Hall studio, right across the street from the League. And for a while, they sat for each other and painted together. So this was clearly given during the height of their friendship, just as a kind of present to Phillip, who we'll get to if we have time, who was an instructor at the League for 33 years and very well known here. So.
Thank you so much, Jerry. Yes, we are going to move on as quickly as we can. The next work is by Agnes Richmond, another lovely female painting. There's a young girl here, and I know that Agnes painted a lot of women and girls. Ellen, would you unmute and let us know a little bit about this?
Yes. Oh, there is one more William Merritt Chase connection. I believe he taught in Studio 5, which is where I teach now. So, Agnes Richmond, as you say, Anki, is known for her portraits of women, mostly middle-aged women. There is some information to indicate that she was sympathetic to the suffragette movement, and she painted women as strong, courageous, independent, and dignified. She painted women of all economic strata. And if you look through her body of work, you can see the respect that she has for her subjects. And I found a couple of paintings of a single man and a single woman together. And in both paintings, the woman is placed in the foreground and the man is placed behind her. This painting struck me because it's so unsentimental. In the hands of a lesser artist, there could potentially be a lot of frou-frou in the clothing from that period of time, but she has a no-nonsense outfit on, and she's looking very thoughtfully at the viewer. She has a lot on her mind, I believe. She wears her hair in a braid so that it doesn't get in her way when she's involved in activities that are important to her. And her hands are not very developed. And I'm thinking that they might be moving while she's sitting, moving as quickly and profoundly as her thoughts do. So I get the feeling of a young girl who's going to grow up to be a very self-confident individual.
Yeah, that is lovely. Yeah, I also like the simplicity in this. It is so direct and so beautiful in its simplicity.
Yes.
And Jerry, you are gonna get the chance to talk about Robert Phillip. We are moving to this painting of his mother.
Yeah, it's interesting. Ellen just used the term unsentimental in the previous portrait. Usually when artists paint their parents, there's a sense of intimacy. There's some kind of sentimentality, and that's completely absent in this painting of his mother. Philip studied at the League and studied at the National Academy. He was a talented enough singer that he briefly stopped painting and was a tenor in opera. But then he returned to painting, and at one point he moved to Paris for the duration of the 1920s. And this was probably painted at that time, his mother in a Paris apartment. We know so little about his duration in Paris that we know virtually nothing about his personal life while he was there. But what we can tell is that he was greatly influenced by French painting at that time. I see a little bit of kind of the interiors of Vuillard's portraiture in the 1920s and 30s, where he got into some naturalism. There's something very powerful about this for its lack of sentimentality. I think this is probably as formidable a female portrait as Philip ever painted. Later on, he returned to the States in the 30s, and he was heralded. Henry McBride, who was the major critic in New York at the time, called him one of the best painters in America when he came back. As over the years, he tended to go more and more towards a Renoir influenced view of the world, which meant a lot of young women sitting at cafes. But this doesn't have that idealization. It's very straightforward and a very clear view of a very powerful looking person who happened to be his mother. I think it's a terrific composition, rather formal, geometric in the way she's enclosed by the frame behind her and by the architectural elements around her. But she dominates the canvas. If we go to the next slide, we'll see another Philip that's in the Lee collection. This was painted in the 1950s. And very briefly, this is a painting of Philip's self-portrait up in one corner, holding the brush. His wife, Rochelle, is watching him paint. And behind them are a crew of Art Students League instructors. On the far left is Stuart Clonis, who for many years was the League president, I want to say. Okay. I think he was still there when I was going to school in the late 70s and early 80s. And this painting hung in the League lobby when I was a student there. So I got to see it virtually every day. It's called Homage to Sargent. You have the Sargent self-portrait hanging on the wall. And among others, I have to refer to my notes, some of the other painters here. John Carroll, Louis Kronberg, Ivan Olinsky. It's a very nice portrait of his that we're not going to get to tonight, but that's in the Lee collection. And Robert Brackman, who's seated with the cigarette hanging from his mouth. So this was Philip getting back to portraiture from time to time. And when he did, he often painted his colleagues at the League. And this is, I think, quite a wonderful picture that encompasses the era when he was instructing and a coterie of friends, of colleagues at the League.
Absolutely. I think this was painted about 16 years after the portrait of his mother. He was about 45 when he painted that. Domineering. I would agree with that. She's dominating the picture, which also seems so much domineering. And then we'll have time for one more. So Ellen, let's look at this painting by Paul Gattuso, somebody who we don't have a lot of information about.
That's right.
Other than he studied with Dumont and Richmond, who also, who else were we talking about who studied with him? I lost track now, but there are a lot of connections between these students and teachers. Yeah.
Yes, and as you mentioned, Anki, there's not much written about Paul Gattuso, but I did find quite a number of examples of cartoon work that he did. And we don't even know the date of his birth, or at least I couldn't find it. But we do know that in 1944, he joined something called the Chesler Shop. I wondered, Jerry, if you know about this through your father's work. So the Chesler Shop provided cartoonists for comic book publications. And this particular painting, I can't tell if this was done from a photograph or real life. I'm not sure. I just wondered about it because the boy, I have a feeling, was not having a great time. I don't think he wanted to put on a white shirt and a tie. His tie is sitting in an untraditional manner, and the collar of the white shirt is floating partially in the air. His feet are impatient, I think. And I think he wants to go out and play. And his eyes are as open to seeing what is around him in the world as his ears are open to listening. I do not find this to be an extremely probing portrait. I think it's a moment in time. And I think it's almost a characterization rather than a probing portrait. And it reminded me of the next slide. Both boys are portrayed as being mischievous rascals, and that's the way boys were expected to be in this time in our history. And neither of them are that probing. They're just a momentary slice of life. And we see he is discovering the dark underbelly of Santa Claus suits here. But they're charming. And they're both a little chuckle-worthy. And it's not to take away from the skill of the artists or their abilities or brain work. I just think that the particular Paul Gattuso was just not as probing a character study as I'm usually drawn to, but I love the composition.
Yeah, absolutely. It is, right there, right in the middle, which is something I also really appreciate. Sometimes less is more. And
That's right.
Yeah.
And Anki, I forgot to mention that Agnes Richmond studied with Kenyon Cox.
Yes.
Who designed the League's logo and wrote the classic point of view. And she taught at the League, I think, from 1910 to 1914.
Yes, she did. So she was one of our early female instructors. And we have a few questions from our audience. And one of the questions is, somebody said, I'm curious about the role of dress in portraiture. If a piece is nude, would it be more likely to be considered a figure study? And what is a nude portraiture, if that is a genre? So that question is for both of you. Anybody wanna?
Oh boy.
Well, at least one recent painter, not a league affiliated painter, but at least one recent painter I can think of, Lucian Freud, made a career out of conflating the two different genres. I think he called his paintings naked portraits. The implication being that there are different ways of portraying the nude. There are different reasons for painting the nude and different ways of portraying. That the nude can be strictly about kind of the sensual appreciation, but it can also, if the artist chooses, can mine deeper veins. If you're not just dealing with the abstraction of male or female beauty, you can also be dealing with the particulars of the individual model.
Yes, I would agree with that, Jerry. I think when an artist is portraying the life that the subject has lived and continues to live, that's a portrait painting, nude or not. But I think if an artist is using the body as a decoration, then it doesn't feel like a portrait to me.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I have one other question, and I think that'll be possibly the last question we will do. The question is, it was mentioned that the intimacy between parent or spouse portraits as artists, and the person is asking, what are the relationships you love to render the most? Is it friends? Is it family? And what relationship might give the largest challenge in that, and what might give the greatest reward?
I love to paint friends, and frequently a model will become a friend if I'm using a professional model. But when I first started painting friends, I worried that how would I get the history of our relationship into this portrait? But I realized that my concerns were unfounded, because the relationship changes when a friend sits for me. And there are whole new areas of connection that are mined. So that's what I love. I love to do that.
And does that happen through conversation, or is it just looking at each other, you feel?
Conversation,
Mm-hmm.
which usually happens during the breaks, but sometimes spills over into the sitting time. And you discover new things about people when they sit for you. I had a neighbor that I lived next to for about 25 years, and he had a tremendous work ethic. He never missed a day of work that I can remember. And when he retired, he said he wanted to sit for me. So he came up to my studio daily and sat for me totally stoically. He had that work ethic. But I had been sitting on his front porch for 25 years, and he's so ebullient. So I engaged him in conversation, and that's how I brought out his ebullience, the changing facial expression.
And that shows up in the work.
Yes.
Yeah. What about you, Jerry?
I think Ellen raises a really good point, a salient point, because often the element that especially students, but even people like myself who've been doing this for forever, find most confounding is when the model is in motion and moving and won't hold the pose. But what I've learned is that that's the kind of challenge we want. I mean, there are painters who need to have the model practically pinioned in place and don't breathe, please. But the movement, if you're smart and your eyes are open, the movement becomes part of the painting, the personality, without the artist being aware of it. It seeps into the work. I've been telling my students, you don't go to the easel with the idea of, oh, this is a facet of personality in my friend or this model that I just want to get down on canvas. You just open yourself up, you do your work, and it gets into it without you thinking about it, if you're receptive.
Yes.
It's not programmatic. It's just being open to what's before you. As far as who I prefer to paint, I don't know. If I'm doing my job and the person in front of me is interesting, then it's all interesting, and there are challenges that family and friends present. Sometimes sometimes it's difficult for us to paint somebody who we know very closely, because we want to do right by them. But I think again, the key is just to be open to the process, whoever is sitting in front of you.
Right. And I have one tie-in question to that from Michaela, who's asking, is there a way to know if a portrait was made from a picture or a person posing? And I know mainly both of you work from the people posing, right?
Yes.
Would you be able to tell? I mean, you said with the Gattuso work, Ellen, that you think that like you can't tell if that was done from a photo or from life.
Right. Sometimes I can tell if it's a very busy scene, let's say in a restaurant or some such crowd scene, or a street scene, sometimes I can tell if the work is rendered to a very high degree of polish, or if there's a flatness to it even. What about you, Jerry?
I used to be able to think I could tell immediately. And the line has gotten a lot blurrier for me in recent years. And it's not just because of my eyesight. It's because there are a lot more able technicians painting than there used to be when I was a student. There are a lot of painters who are technically very good, and they're learning to use and integrate digital and photography into their imagery in a more sophisticated way. It used to be you could tell right off if somebody was just copying a photo. And now the playing field is more difficult for me to discern. My own, as Anki was referencing, my own taste is I'm really only interested in working from life for some of the reasons that were implicit in what we've been talking about. Having the model in front of you and having the person-to-person interaction is always more interesting to me.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, that is what we have been talking about, the relationship between the two people, the artist and the person that they're painting or drawing. Somehow something seems to be added in that communication when they're actually there in person.
Yes.
Yeah.
The painting is about your encounter with each other. And I have no desire to create a painting that's technically perfect. I want it to be driven by my response to the individual, the changing facial expressions, even the changing light that brings out different aspects of the form in different conditions of light, the different moods that both artist and subject come into the studio with. And then the changes that occur in both of us during the course of the sittings, because we're together and our relationships change. So that's what it's all about for me.
The painting becomes an expression of experiences in time.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And I think we see that so clearly in this show, because those experiences in time are very much part of what we see in this show. So I just want to thank you both, Ellen Eagle and Jerry Weiss, so much for your time, for your insight this evening, and for sharing all these unique stories about connections, relationships, and the many faces of the League. And thank you to our participating audience for your questions. And we will be uploading a recording of tonight's program to our YouTube channel. It will also be available on Facebook. So you can just subscribe to the Art Students League on YouTube, and please follow us on Instagram at ASLNYC. And the show is going to be up this week. It's Monday through Friday from 11 to 6. So hopefully some of you will have a chance to come here and see it in person. So we wish you a great rest of the evening. And as always, stay healthy.
Thank you so much, Anki.
Yes, thank you, Anki.
Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you, Ellen.